What is up, guys? It is Barry Michael Doyle here, and in this video I'm going to talk a little bit more about some React hooks. Today I'm going to be explaining the useContext hook, and this hook is really great because we can use it as a solution to avoid passing props down components. You know, when you have to put like your state at the top level components and pass it all the way down through to children, we don't have to do that if we start implementing useContext with React. And it's also another way to do this kind of thing without having to rely on using Redux, which is, always a lot of boilerplate that you don't really want to deal with. Anyway, let's head over to VS Code so I can show you a scenario of where this will be helpful. Right, so here we are it's an input component. Basically, it takes in a name input and it takes in a points input. And then there's a submit button. And the submit button I've made as another component in here, which it submits to Firebase. So this isn't really too relevant. The important thing to know is we're passing these props here, name, points, set name, and set points, all into this function because we need to set name to be empty if this submit is clicked after we submitted and it was successful, and we'll set points to empty as well. So we await, we do an update, we say if it's submitting. The whole point is this is a complicated component because you've got to handle the is submitting state and you've got to handle actually submitting the contestant. So I put it into its own component just because you don't want to make your full component too messy here. And I'd actually like to put this name component into its own component and the points component so that we can manage state separately. But the reason it's up here is because submit needs to have access to the name and points values. Because if we look at our submit component, when we add a contestant, we need to provide a points value and a names value. So that's pretty important. So we have a solution here. It works fine. If we look at our app, this is the app I use for some live streaming, and we're specifically looking at this contestant input. We have the name, which works. You can update it, and we have points, which should be like a number. And if I submit these points, it actually works. It goes to a Firebase thing, and it's all good. So what's happening here, if we look in the code, whenever I change the name input, we use state and we set the name. We set the name to e.target.value. So the name is being set and it's a controlled component now, and its value is always linked to name, which the default value for name is an empty string. And the exact same thing happens with points. We have points in here and we have an empty value here. It's an empty string. That's our value initially. Whenever this changes, we pass in set points e.target.value, and it will go through and set the points to whatever this value is, which should be whatever we type. So again, if we look in our app, I'm typing in name, it's a controlled component, and I'm typing in name here, or I'm typing in points, and it's a controlled input there as well, which is excellent. It is just what we want. Now the thing is, if I head back over to this, we have a submit button. Now submit button, we need to have the name because we need to know what name we're passing through when we submit, and the points. And we also need the set name function and the set points function, which is, kind of a pain because you want to clear the name and you want to clear the points. If we were to put name into its own component, we'd do something like this. We'd say name, and we'd have to say name equals name, and set points equals set points. And then, if we're not set points, it's supposed to be set name, my bad. So set name will be set name. And then we'll have a similar thing for points. So I'll just copy this down here and I'll make another component points. Points will be, it will have the points value that you have to pass down. And we'll have the set points value that we have to pass down. So that would theoretically replace this input over here, and it would theoretically replace this input over here. So let's just quickly go make that so that you have a bit of an idea of what we're doing. I'm going to make a new name folder to hold my name folder and a new points folder to hold my points. So points will have an index.js and name will have an index.js. And that's pretty much good to go. Let me just write the component out quickly. We're going to import React from React. Nothing new and big and fancy here. We'll make a const name component, which will take in, the props will be name and set name. And if I was gonna, well, I could actually just write the component as is in here. And if I copy it from our contestants input, this is what our name component will be. So that should work, and then we just need to export default name, and I'm going to copy this whole thing because points is very similar. It's just points will be called points, and the placeholder will be points, and then these values here, this value will be points, and we'll have a set points, and over here we will set points, and the value here will be points. So pretty straightforward. That means in our contestant input we can import name and points from here. So I'm just going to import name. That comes from /name, which is the component we just created, and then we import points, which comes from the points component that we just created, and that is perfect. Now we can get rid of these because they do the same thing, and we can get rid of these. Now this works. It will still work. It works wonderfully. It's what we expect. If I go here and I type in, let's type my own name in here, give me 10 points, it actually still works. So no problem there. Everything's working as expected. The problem that I have with this is we've got this whole name set name thing. It's really messy, and points set points thing. And I find that passing props down are really annoying. So what I've usually done to get around this, I've used Redux in my apps, but this tutorial is about using context, because Redux kind of works a lot like context. You have a provider, and that provides some values. The provider will provide name, set name, points, and set points, and we should be good to go there. I think before I continue, I just want to do something else here. I'm going to make this name component and the points component a little bit bigger, just because I want to have a function to handle change. So handle change, we'll take e, and then we'll set name to e.target.value, because I like to keep my JSX clean, so I might as well follow that up by doing something like that. So we're good there. And again, similar thing with points. Then we just copy the handle change here. We'll put it in our points component. I'm changing this from an arrow body function to just like a normal function here. That's a little ES6 shortcut that I was using that I am kind of no longer using. And this will be set points. Cool, perfect. And this whole value in here is just going to refer to handle change. Right. Anyway, as I was saying, back to creating a context. So what I want to do is essentially have something where we don't have to pass these props in, where we can actually subscribe to these props from the components themselves. Now, in order to do that, what I'm going to need to do is create a context. So from React, I'm going to import create context over here, and then I'm going to call it const input context. Yeah, let's just call it input context. And here we'll say create context. I mean, you could also just say react.create context and not import it there, but this is good for now. And then you need to put a default value in here. So the values that I want to have in this context object of mine are name, set name, points, and set points. So let's add those in. Name by default, I'll make it an empty string. Points will also be an empty string by default. And the default functions right now, we're just going to make them like a function that returns null. Like just because you need to have a default in there, because if you don't have a default in there, if you ran this and for some reason we're using the context and we forgot to set the values in the provider for this context, this would be undefined. And if you try to do an on-click for an on-change or something for undefined, your app would crash, and we do not want that. So this is just kind of a fallback to have this context here. Now, the next thing that we're going to have to do is we're going to have to wrap this like in a provider. Well, we wrap all the components that are going to use this context in a provider. So the provider is actually InputContext.Provider. So let's do that now. We'll wrap InputContext.Provider over here. And then we've wrapped all our stuff in our input context provider here. Now this input context provider, we need to reset these default values. So to do that, I'm just going to say value is equal to an object, and I'm going to put these values in here. So essentially, if you said name, here's a little ES6 shortcut, and points. If the variable name is the same as the key, you can just shortcut that to name and points like that. So I'm going to do the same with set name and set points. So there we go, we're pretty sorted there. We've we've replaced the default value over here now with the value of these set states. Now the point is, what we've got now, we've got this provider, so we can start using these values from our actual name component, from our points component, and from our submit component. Now that means we can get rid of these. So I'm going to start by getting rid of those for name, and then I'm going to go to the name component and show you what we're doing here. So the first thing we need to get from React is useContext, and this is the useContext hook. Now we're also going to need to import our InputContext, which I think I forgot to export. So this InputContext, we need to export. So now if I go here, I can import InputContext. It's a named export, not a default export, from dot slash. So this goes back to the index of the parent of this component. So there we go, perfect. We have our input context. Over here, instead of having these set name and name props, I'm going to get name and set name from our context. So what you can say is context, and you can say use context over here, and we're going to use the input context. Now note, you've got to say input context, the full thing, not input context.provider and like not input context.context. It is just input context as is. Perfect. And now down here you can say context.setName and context.name, because the context that we're getting here is actually the context that we're setting here. Here's the value of the context, and this object over here is the context. Now I'm going to destructure it. Instead of saying context dot, I'll just say name and set name, so we can destructure that from context, which is great. So now these components will be subscribing to whenever the context changes instead of individual things. So if your components get more complicated, then your components that are relevant to the context, they will re-render, but the other ones that aren't actually subscribing to this won't re-render, which is excellent, and it's just what we need. And this is why you kind of keep your React components small as possible. So let's just do points quickly. This is going to be fairly straightforward. I'm just going to copy what I did before, so this should just be a refresher from what we just did. We'll say use context, and then we'll import input context. If I could spell correctly, that would be helpful. And we get that from // Perfect. Now finally, I'm going to say const, and this time we're going to get points and set points from, not from, it's equals, sorry. Use context, we use the context hook and we pass the input context that we are referring to. So that's the context that we're going to use. That means back over here, we can get rid of these because we don't have to pass these props in anymore. Simple enough. Now the next thing, we want to get rid of these. So we're getting rid of name, points, set name, and set points. So that's going to change to pretty much just this. But that means over here, instead of getting all these values from here, I'm going to cut that, and we're going to put those values in context. So we're going to say const that equals use context, and we'll say input context. Now remember, we've automatically fetched input context from there, so that's good. Yeah, I guess I could. This is the same as // So I also need to import use context from React because we need to get that value and use it from the React library. So if I save that, our project runs, and I can look here, and I should be able to type in myself again and do this. What happens when I click submit is it will add me. This is just Firebase command. It's going to use the name from the context, and it's going to use points from the context, and then after that it's going to set name to be an empty string, and it's going to set points to be an empty string. So theoretically, if I do this, it should successfully submit me and then clear me. It submitted and then it cleared. It cleared once the submit was actually done. So that was that, and that's how you can use this. Now this was a pretty basic example because our context here was just, you know, really referring to a specific little block of code. Everything was in our contestant input, so I put this here. Now you can use this like in larger parts of your app. I made a video about hooks where I showed you how to make a use viewport hook. I use a context there, and then I kind of wrap my whole app in the provider. So you can make this at the root level of your app and then make things subscribe to that. But the whole point is, you know, even if name, like if you put a component in name, like, let's just say we randomly decided to put points in here as well. And we, for some weird reason, decided to put like our points component in here. And then we got points from import. Sorry, my bad. This is just an example. Import points from /points. And then we put points in there. Now let me just comment this points out because I don't want to show it twice. So we imagine we put this points into name over there. I do have an issue. What is wrong? Oh, right. I'm trying to import points from something that doesn't exist right now. So what I am doing here is suddenly our component works again, but instead this points component is lying deeper down. This points component is in our name component. So what we essentially have in our contestant input is name is rendering points as well, which is also using context, but it's using context like lower down. Over here we put points in, we didn't have to put any variables in there. We just grabbing context from lower down the tree. It's a bit weird to explain, but theoretically, make my second name and give this 20 points. This should still work, and it does. So my point there that I was trying to prove, which I'm going to try and unprove now by moving back, get rid of those fragments, is I can move points back out to here. And basically the context can be used at any level. So anything, as long as it is a component that is wrapped somewhere in this provider, we should be good. Like anywhere, as long as this component where you're trying to use the context is inside the provider. So even if something is inside name or inside points or inside submit, those components within these components can use this input context. They just need to be wrapped by the provider. If you wanted to make a context somewhere else, if you want to use it outside of this provider, you just have to move your provider like further up in the code so that it does something like this. But for our use case here, I'm just going to do it there because it's strictly used only over there. Anyways, guys, that was that for this video. It is a weird concept, but if you check out my video about hooks, we kind of use it here as well, where I created a whole hook to use this context. We created a custom hook and we made use of context to hold the values. Very cool stuff, very fun things that will really make your code a lot cleaner to read. Because look at this, now we look at our whole input context and we didn't have to pass those props everywhere like we did before. I mean, I think I could just go all the way back to what we had. And previously we had something like this, which was quite a... I like to keep my JSX clean. This is what our JSX looked like. I know it requires a lot of extra boilerplate, but if I go all the way forward, it's just going to be simply name, points, and context. Okay, something went wrong in me actually fixing this, but that should be quick to fix because I can just remove all the props and all of that. And it makes your components easier to read in the sense that they can be placed here. I forgot to add a value in here, sorry. Terrible, not even fixing my code, trying to explain things and doing a horrible job in the process. There we go, set points. Essentially, it depends what your practice is, but if you find that adding in like props is a mission, I think it's quite nice because this whole component, you're no longer passing values around. So there's less sort of points for things to go wrong. You're rather like saying, okay, I don't want to try pass things down. And especially the problem is if you're up here and you go like 5 components deep, you don't want to pass props down each component. You'd rather just use the context and then you can directly like fetch the value from whatever component that's wrapped in here. I do find it to be really, really nice. Obviously, if you're using Redux and familiar with that, you don't really need this, but I have found in my personal projects that like I actually use a combination of context and Redux and it works really well. As long as you keep your code organized, do what works for you, what works for your project. I don't know what's happening here. This is confused. It should be fine. I'll fix that later. Anyway, my video worked. It showed you that it worked. You should be good. Context there is being used. Everything's fine. I just need to restart my program. That's actually the problem. If I yarn start now, it should work. But yeah, that was me, guys. That's me for the video. If you enjoyed it, please leave a like and a comment. I really appreciate it. And yeah, check out our live stream. We've been live streaming building this app, and we sort of went through using context and we went through using reducers. Now we're actually moving our project to Firebase, so that's how this whole thing works, where we can remove it and it's updating directly on Firebase and not like through our in-app stuff. So if I like refresh the page or came on as a different browser, like I could see this value because this is a Firebase value. Anyways, I'll fix this off camera. I hope you guys enjoyed the video, and I'll catch you next time. Cheers.